Originally in Spanish, April 1st, 2022. As explained before, there is no material world and spiritual world as separate realms, and everything depends on perception, because as a universal truth, there is only one single mass as the original source. Being that what we understand as the material world is only potential energy within a field that is the ether, which, with a focus based on perception, whether personal or collective as agreements that are interpreted in the mind consciousness of the observer, generates the elaborate illusion of living within something that is not part of the observer, as the dual or duality concept of self versus that which is not self is created. That is the illusion of the outside world, being that everything is generated from the consciousness of the observer. And from that point of view, the attachments to the ideas that we consider as defining us as who we are, what defines our I, is what forms our ego, the concept of being someone and not something or someone else. But what is that complete and unique field we call ether, from which everything comes out, which is understood in some way as source itself? To explain this exceeds all capacity of scientific measurement, because even with the highest technology, it will only be possible to measure something, a part, or a range of a much more expanded whole, which extends to infinity. It is therefore incomprehensible to any being who holds the idea of being someone and not something else or someone else. It is beyond the reach of any being with a self-concept of having an I or an ego. Ego being understood here as a near synonym for I, under definitions of the word ego used by Sophia Swaruu Yaschi. That is to say that she does not see the ego as the negative part of the I, as opposed to Carl Gustav Jung, who said that the ego is what results from the destruction of the I. For Sophia and for me, the word ego simply comes from its original Latin root ego, which means I. Only that, without any positive, negative, or degrading or degenerative connotation. Back to the ether. It is defined using the best comprehension capabilities we have as a super high frequency vibrational potential energy field that obeys flow dynamics, flux, or energy flow vectors congruent to what is defined in fluid dynamics. In other words, it has liquid qualities. It is even mentioned in the Bible as the waters of the heavens, with the understanding that somehow this was already known. We have learned very little about how ether itself functions as a substance, since basically the moment we observe it as a substance, we are giving it a quality apart from the rest. That is to say, ether as a definition is one thing and not another, destroying what it is in the process, since any definition we can give it will fall short, and it will not only be what we say it is, but much more, being that whatever we say ether is, anything, it will define it, since it is everything. But we will always fall short of being able to define it because of the vastness it represents and the limited resources we have to understand it with. And I speak from the point of view of advanced interstellar societies. Defining it lies more within the field of philosophy than of hard science, since the latter will only understand it from its own limited point of view. But within what is scientifically known, from the point of view that I share of practical hard science applied in the matter of knowledge of advanced interstellar civilizations, it is this. The ether is not anywhere, but everything is ether, being that it can be understood that at least a part of what can be measured of the ether cannot be found among things, nor is it somewhere, but everything is ether, and functions as a fluid that many call universal solvent, which is a substance that in theory dissolves everything that exists. And within the understanding of physical substances itself, the one that would correspond the most, or the one that would come closest to defining ether, would be water. It is known that the ether functions under what is very similar to what on Earth is called fluid dynamics. That is to say, the ether behaves like water in many of its observable aspects. Being within it, it is not like the fish that only lives in its environment within the water. It flows and mixes, amalgamating its molecules, and moves in complex flows according to the stimulus it receives. The ether has a flow or direction of flow of its potential energy, and we understand this flow as gravity. Already from more philosophical points of view, but at the edge of what is understandable by non-human science, it is understood to be pure consciousness. Beyond that, it is unreachable, impossible to measure, much less to understand. So, seeing and observing the ether, observing all that exists from the point of view of a being with mind in high densities, for lack of better words and names, and from the empirical understanding of a being with that capacity of understanding, the ether is summarized in a soup of its own ideas, a logical progression sequence of mental experiences given by the very consciousness that composes it. Progression of ideas as in the sequence of thoughts that a consciousness has that defines the flux or direction of flow of potential energy within the ether, being that it is that itself without separation. The flux within the potential energy field ether is the flow or progression of ideas of that superconsciousness within it. And that flux is what we understand as gravity. I now join this conversation or viewpoint above to what was explained in the previous part of Stellar Navigation 3. The onboard computer, as this superconsciousness I speak of above, by way of emulating it, sees everything as energy, not as positions on a map, since the idea or concept of a position, something here, therefore not there, is relative to the experience interpretation of the etheric field and does not define the ether itself. That is, it is a point of view relative to a limited set of concepts that something or someone with a self-concept or ego has generated as an idea. That is, distances are only an idea based on the viewpoint relative and limited to someone with an ego being, with the idea of being someone and therefore not someone else. Which brings us to the principle of non-locality. The principle of non-locality defines that there are no places in the ether. There are no distances, no points on a map, being that those are generated only from a set of ideas that someone holds, and that will be relative to that entity only, and does not apply equally to other entities that hold different set of ideas. The progression of ideas, the thought with logic that shapes a series of sequences of experience or ideas within a field generated by being with consciousness, is time. And since each being with consciousness will have its own ideas and its own speed of thought, time can only be relative to that being and does not apply to any other. Only similarly, depending on the agreements they share with each other. In the same way, distances are also relative to the interpretation of a being with consciousness and its fellow beings with similar agreements of perception. Being that distances can only be measured and understood relative to time, by relation of speed and displacement within those distances. Making distances again remain only as a concept entertained within a mind with consciousness. So, not only is there the concept that everything is now and that time does not exist, being that it is only a perception and not something apart from the observer, but also that everything is here, everything is now. What generates the progression of time is the flow of ideas, which in turn generates an experience. And what generates distances is only time applied to an idea or set of ideas that interpret or self-interpret as distances. This brings us to define the concept of interdimensionals as many people allege, from the point of view that extraterrestrials do not exist and what is seen are interdimensionals. Again, using the bad human habit of thinking that if it is one thing, it is not the other, losing the notion of the inclusiveness of multiple reasons in one. From that point of view, it is true. Extraterrestrials are interdimensional. And that could be sustained from the very point of view of extraterrestrials themselves, since, as I have just explained above, the non-human science itself defines the ether as a single mass without locality and without time, being that these two concepts depend only on the point of view, which is relative to each observer consciousness. That is to say that from the point of view of the ether, everything is now and everything is here. The universe, as explained by human science, only exists within the very definition of human perception using limited thinking tools called science. That is to say that the definition of how the universe exists and what it is and how the universe works only works as a model that depends on what is accepted by human science in the whole of its field of specialty: astrophysics, mathematics, quantum physics, and philosophy. And it only applies and is only valid for those who accept and regard this model of understanding as their own. But from the understanding of the non-human science of the interstellar civilizations, that is to say, where they already apply their science in a practical way and not in a theoretical way as it happens with the human astrophysics, time and distance exist only as perceptions of an individual with a conscious mind. And they can be applied for practical purposes using machines and artifacts that obey the rules found by the understanding of their science. This set of rules, as understood within non-human science of basically all highly interstellar civilizations, states that the entire ether field is interpreted as potential energy that will have an exact and measurable and unique frequency. Frequency that defines the potential energy accumulated at a reference point, and the flow of movement of that energy in the field, thereby blending the concept of non-locality and non-time with the perception of the understanding of those beings that hold this kind of science. From our point of view, as beings with consciousness and interpretation of time and distance by our own empirical experience of being alive, we interpret that exact and measurable frequency of which I speak above as points on a traditional map of distances and as objects that exist within that map. But from the more expanded point of view, and the one applied by the powerful navigation computers of interstellar spacecraft, there are only energy patterns and interactions between those energy patterns, intermingling and forming other patterns by influencing each other within a field of potential energy without spatio-temporal locality. That is to say, they only see numerical patterns with mathematical relationships between them that represent values that in turn represent things, distances, and dynamics of movement. And they do not see places or objects as we, beings with consciousness and ego eyes, would see them. This mathematical numeric field representing energy values within a high-frequency vibrational field called ether is nothing more nor less than the matrix, which from Earth's point of view can be interpreted as digital. And since everything inside this energetic mathematical matrix is energy, and these computers see it as such at the subatomic level, then it is possible to modify the energetic mathematical values that compose it, thus taking control over the environment, over the matrix itself. Now, explaining how this mathematical energetic matrix works. Every particle that exists levitates an energy value and exists as a particle and not as energy, only from certain points of view and not from others. What defines a particle is that it does not behave as a wave, but as a defined object with mass, separated from the environment in which it is located. What defines and produces such a particle is that it has a harmonic of a frequency that produces a standing wave effect that concentrates the potential energy in a specific continuous point, thereby creating the particle, which in turn and through more harmonics of a frequency together will create more complex matter, as explained in Mechanics of Manifestation. So each particle, and consequently all matter, will have a specific mathematics that composes it. Being that the harmonic of a frequency is understood by non-human science as movements within the flow of the gravitational field. Everything that exists has consciousness, because it is sustained by the mathematical energetic action of the field that surrounds it. And everything that exists has consciousness because everything is ether, as I explained above. There is no separation of things without consciousness and with consciousness, being that everything is one mass, and everything that exists and that we understand as objects, things, energy, anything, is ether. About attachments to ideas that form the concept of ego and I. Those ideas that people do not let go of, that which defines them as such as one person and not the other, creates and is a flow of gravity within a field that is the ether, as I explained in detail above. As such ideas are recurring, they are self-feeding by creating a specific energy flow or flux within the field, with measurable mathematics and reproducibility. And what is a self-feeding recurring energy field? In a mathematical model, it is interpreted with the equations that govern vortex dynamics or vortex mathematics. That is to say, that vortex dynamics is a toroid, one and the same. We are whirlwinds of wind, born from the etheric field of the atmosphere that surrounds us, going around a few times, dusting everything in our path, and then at the end of the energetic mathematical dynamics that fed us, we dissolve again to be only air, what we have always been and what we will always be. But not only beings with consciousness and self-consciousness are like this. Everything that is matter and energy is this as well. Everything is self-feeding. Everything is sustained by its own action. And that mathematics of vortexes, toroid, that governs all that exists are the harmonics of a frequency that sustain matter as such within a field of potential energy that is the ether. That is to say, the ideas and how they are structured, their congruence together with the persistence they demonstrate, form matter. Explaining also the tulpas and the egregors. In Mechanics of Manifestation, it was explained how the action of harmonics of a frequency create the standing wave, which in turn will create the particle, which in turn will join with others to form matter. But although correct, this is a linear explanation, therefore somewhat simplistic. As in a harmonic that rises and moves through time. That is why it is harmonic. That is, this explanation is valid only when looking at time in a linear way, as it is interpreted on Earth, and not in a complex way as it is understood by non-human science. Being that there is a component missing in this explanation of mechanics of manifestation. And that component is the one I just explained above. The harmonic of a frequency that sustains a particle develops with vortex mathematics. That is, it is self-feeding in a toroidal fashion, in the way that it recycles energy within itself. However, as all vortex mathematics also dictates, there is also a constant of external influencing factors of the toroid. That is, the energetic mathematic field that surrounds it. Applying this to a person, if a particle or an individual is a self-feeding toroid with its own internal mathematics, it will also be influenced and will itself not only be influenced but will be a product of the other energetic mathematical dynamics that surround it. That is to say that the toroid is not alone, but is fed by the field in which it is immersed. Field that forms and defines it, just as the air forms, sustains, and dissipates a wind whirlwind. So the toroid that forms all that is matter is also influenced by external fields that in turn, if they are self-feeding and self-defining, are also toroids. So the mathematical energetic reality of the matrix, where we are, is a toroid inside another toroid, almost to infinity or to infinity. because that toroidal energy dynamics starts from the smallest particle to the superaccumulus galaxies and more, equally. So with my long explanation, you can interpret everything around us, time and space, matter and energy, with numerical factors and values representing masses, and their progression with mathematical relation to each other creates the space-time frame where they are. And as I explained above, nothing is separate from what surrounds it. Everything influences each other. Everything forms everything, that in turn will form other things, all within the whole that is the ether, and in itself the original source. Nothing is separate, and any alteration of the mathematical energetic order will create an effect that will alter the whole system. As what surrounds us helped us to form us, our concept of ego, of I, we are not only the product of our free will, but we can only take actions and thoughts that are congruent within the field in which we are immersed. And that defines us as much as we define the field ourselves, beings with our own consciousness. Understanding that everything that exists has its own consciousness. From this point of view, it is difficult to sustain that there is free will as such, since we are not entities apart from others, but we are nodes within a field that in turn forms other, more expanded fields, and so on. Moving forward with the subject. By being able to understand the energetic mathematical matrix, a computer can guide a frequency modulator called either magnetic engine or tractor beam to alter the matrix and its energetic mathematical dynamics and be able to insert an object, situation, or person into it. In parentheses, I must explain that situations, as well as matter, are dynamics of mathematical energetic flow within a field where one equation will give way to another and another successively with perfect mathematical precision, and only within the limitations of its own logical framework itself. So, as reality is formed by recurrent energy processes that in turn form others, toroid within mathematical energetic toroid, it will never be possible to insert an object of one toroid into another without also creating the mathematical ties of harmonics of a frequency that sustain what is inserted into the receiving toroid. In fact, this is how it is really done. You do not insert an object inside a receiving place, but you create, by means of energetic imposition, the energetic mathematical factors and their relationship with the environment that in turn will form said object. Being that one can very well define a density such as the misnamed 5D or the misnamed 3D as toroids with their own energetic mathematical dynamics, which in turn are unique and also apart from each other, which also influence each other. This means that you cannot introduce an object, person, or situation from one toroid to another without also creating a reason why that person, object, or situation exists there in the first place. Which explains why nothing extraterrestrial from 5D can exist as such in 3D without the energetic mathematical dynamics itself that sustain 3D, normalizing it by forming the necessary equations that sustain such an extraterrestrial thing, idea, or a person within the 3D matrix. That is, introducing anything, person, or situation will also create a logical reason why it exists there in the receiving location in the first place. Since 5D includes 3D, the reason why something can be transported from 3D to 5D is already built into its mathematics. But the reverse it is not, because, as we have explained before, 3D does not include 5D, so it lacks the mathematical energetic dynamics that form it. Therefore, whatever we try from 5D will always have a logical explanation within the framework of 3D understanding. That is why we cannot give proof, because by giving them we also automatically form why they exist, but within the 3D framework of understanding, thereby destroying their 5D origin. By mathematical laws, there will always be formed a non-extraterrestrial explanation to everything. And the mirrors are nothing more than the 3D matrix normalizing the presence of someone who has their origin outside the 3D toroid and its mathematically sustained existential dynamics. Wow, thank you. And the question, that reason inside 3D when inserting something from 5D, how is it generated? By itself? What is the process? The process is mathematical. That is, if there is an object, let's say a pot, and it is inserted there as proof of the ETs, the mere presence of the pot will affect the field around it. Their mathematics not only includes the standing waves that support it as an object with mass, but they also create the time flow that supports those waves. That is to say, for there to be an energetic dynamic that sustains the existence of the pot, there must be a previous dynamic that sustains the current one. And that previous dynamic is why it is there. Who put it there? Where it came from? Where it was bought? Who bought it from the warehouse and how? The manufacturer. How it was made? With what material? Bearing in mind that this is manipulation from the point of view of ether. Everything is affected atemporally and without locality. That is to say, the retroaction of the dynamics that explains the existence of the object does not matter. Thank you. And one more thing. We talk about 3D, 5D, but they don't really exist. They are just mental states. It doesn't matter if you are on Earth, you can be in 5D, or up there, being in 3D. How does that apply here? The non-existence of densities and inserting objects. Everything is mental. All the mathematical energetic flow that I talk about and that I explained today in the first part here are fluctuations and flows of ideas within a field of consciousness, which is the ether. So densities are just mental states. That is why one person will see an extraterrestrial evidence, for example a spacecraft, but another will see a gas balloon glowing with the light of Venus. Another point of extreme importance is that when inserting a thing, object, situation, or person, either with the tractor beam that imprints or coming down to Earth or by portal or whatever, you just have to put the object there artificially, in whatever way. In the case of the tractor beam, printing the exact dynamics of the energetic mathematical values forming the pot. And you don't have to print or modify the whole 3D Earth reason why it exists there. That is, by just inserting something there, an energetic chain reaction with atemporal action that will automatically form the reason that holds the object, person, or situation there will be created. You just insert the object and the matrix will alter its values by the very mass of the object and in proportional relation to the energy of the object. Because everything is interconnected and everything affects everything completely from the base, which is the ether. So the before and after do not exist, they just are. Why will one reason appear and not another? Simply by energetic mathematical proximity of more propitious possibilities, for being more influential than other possibilities. That's why if we insert something in Finland, the reason would be Mr. Olsen, and not Mrs. Hernandez from La Paz, Bolivia. Because it would not make sense, and the logical sense obeys mathematically established patterns, and this to absolute complexity that escapes our total understanding of it. Sure, but from your perspective it would be memory insertion, although generated etherically. And therefore, from what I understand, there are ethical reasons why you cannot insert objects, no? What you said explains it very well. Yes, because you create what some call shock waves within the receiving matrix, which are nothing more than the alteration of reality resulting from the action of the mathematical energetic rearrangement of the place or density. I understand why that could be considered as invasive then, because for such a reason to be self-generated, it will probably have to influence memories of people who will be in contact with that object. They would be false memories in this case. So that would be intrusive and unethical, right? To introduce memories into another person, unless that person is only matrix. Yes, it can be, but that again obeys complex ethics. From your perspective of understanding where it came from, 5D perspective, They are false memories. For Mr. Olsen, it is only a memory that he can corroborate with his wife and his sister-in-law, who accompanied him to buy that object. And if you bring Sindriel's object to Temer, that doesn't happen, does it? No, because it is within the same energetic mathematical dynamics wrongly called 5D. And what forms those toroids with their dynamics are the consciousnesses and their mentality, as I explained in depth today above. Okay, I understand. And one more question, something I don't understand. If there are no Ds, why is there a difference between bringing the object from 5D to Earth and the other way round? Because from there to here, it is not possible without what you explain, but the other way round, yes? When bringing the object from 3D to 5D, although they don't exist, wouldn't the same thing happen? I say it from the point of view that there are no Ds. No, because as I already explained, or it was explained years ago, the 5D encompasses the 3D, but not the other way around. That is to say, if you take something out of the 5D and insert it in the 3D, it will only observe the 3D reason for its existence, while the 3D, being of less complexity, does not encompass, does not have the formulas that govern the mathematical energetics of the 5D. Therefore, the field only normalizes with what is the same field. That is to say, with the group of formulas that govern the existence of the 3D without being able to incorporate the more advanced and complex formulas of the 5D. That is to say that 5D would be handled with 7-digit energetic mathematics, as an example, while 3D only with 4. So 3D does not understand the energetic mathematics of 5D and only interprets it by rounding the numbers that represent the dynamics of the introduced object or person, which causes the 3D mirrors of people to look like deformed caricatures of the object or person in the more complex 5D. This also reflects why DNA is more complex as you go along, increasing in complexity at higher densities, being that, of course, there are none, and it is just a way of verbalizing or explaining this, because everything is a state of mind and perception, where a person who has a mind that understands more, that is able to process more stimuli, will be in a higher density than a person who cannot process more than limited stimuli, thus limiting the perception of 3D people to 3D. I hope that what I have said makes sense and is understood. These are very complex topics.